Now, among the things that they were accusing the publisher of, that they had tapped and hacked phones, hired private investigators to secretly place listening devices inside people's cars and homes, and impersonated individuals to obtain medical information and financial records.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to Here's the Scoop from NBC News. I'm Yasmin Vasugian. So Prince Harry, Sir Elton John, and other British celebrities just lost a privacy lawsuit against the publisher of the Daily Mail. The impacts this verdict has on Harry's bigger fight against the tabloids and his trip back home. Plus, top Democrats are starting to withdraw support from Maine Senate candidate Graham Platner after a new allegation of sexual assault. More on that and what it could mean for Dems' hopes of winning back the Senate. Up first, though, President Trump kicked off the NATO summit in Turkey by meeting with Turkish President Erdogan and criticizing his allies, saying he's, quote, very disappointed with NATO. His criticism ranges from defense spending to the lack of involvement in the U.S.'s war with Iran. Meanwhile, NATO allies are concerned about the war in Ukraine and that President Trump could splinter the alliance altogether. So can NATO convince President Trump to change his tune? And what can they accomplish in these high-stakes meetings? For that, I'm going to bring in NBC News Chief White House Correspondent Garrett Haake, who is traveling with the president. Hey, Garrett.
Hello.
So the president has had a continuously, I would say, strained relationship with both the organization of NATO along with many of the NATO allies. How is he being received? And I'm wondering if at all the World Cup is playing into any of this friction.
Well, look, I'd say so far it's been pretty smooth sailing, but tomorrow will be the bigger day with more meetings with more of the NATO leaders. His only real significant time so far has been with President Erdogan of Turkey, whom President Trump has said if it weren't for the fact that he was the host and he was the person who invited Trump, he might not have come at all. They have a mutual respect, at least to some degree, and that goes a long way. As for the soccer of it all, we'll see how much that comes up with any of the leaders here on the sidelines. I will point out that Turkey also beat the United States in the group stage back when it didn't really matter because we were already going through. So at least in terms of like the soccer diplomacy aspect, we'll see. There's nothing specific with Belgium on the dance card, if you will, for tomorrow. But I'd be shocked if this doesn't come up in some way.
A big focus of the talks is going to be the defense spending targets. The president has been focused on this since his first term. He wants everyone to commit to setting aside 5% of GDP by 2035. Who's on board with this?
Well, pretty much everybody says they're on board with it except for Spain. I mean, they're the only member of the alliance who says they don't want to go that high. The better question, or the more interesting question longer term, is who can actually pull it off. And in that case, we're seeing several countries kind of on the front lines with Russia make moves in the right direction. Poland, the Baltic states, some of the Scandinavian countries like Sweden and Finland, who already have pretty robust militaries of their own. The Turks also, have the second biggest army in NATO. They're on the front lines of this, having a sea border with Russia. But some of America's biggest traditional allies have not done enough to even put themselves on a path to get to that level of spending. The biggest laggard is probably the UK. And so I expect the president to voice his frustration with that pretty significantly, probably tomorrow during some of these bigger meetings. And remember, the 5% isn't even really 5%. It's like 3.5% on the military, 1.5% on infrastructure. So that could be like building runways or something on your air bases. There are ways to make this work. And as much as this has gotten a lot of play, most of the alliance kind of agrees that this is necessary. Russia spends like 40% of their GDP on defense. And so the allies do have to step this up here, but who domestically is able to pull that off, or at least convincingly take steps in the right direction, has shown a little bit of a fissure in NATO about sort of the domestic politics of each of these individual countries, but also the degree to which they really view Russia in this moment as a real threat.
So let's talk more about Russia being a threat, because NATO also wants all the allies to commit $80 billion, to pledge $80 billion in military aid this year to Ukraine. Is the president on board with that?
I don't think he has confirmed it or denied it one way or the other, I think sort of holistically that is not in keeping with his approach. He doesn't want to give anything to Ukraine. I think the bigger concession from the U.S. will be something that doesn't have the paper value necessarily, but would be huge in this fight, and that would be granting Ukraine or any other countries along that front line licenses to build the materials that they need the most. And those are those interceptors for Patriot missiles. Right now, only the Germans and the Japanese are the only other countries who are allowed to build their own interceptors. Ukraine desperately needs those. This is a product that you cannot buy. They cannot be made fast enough. So if that's something that the president could be convinced to allow the Ukrainians or the Poles or the Finns or somebody else to do, that would be a big give without writing a check. I'd be watching that space for action more than I think the president's going to suddenly find a pot of money that he's willing to give to the Ukrainians.
How much is the war with Iran a part of the conversation there so far? And what I mean more specifically by that is the president's criticisms of the NATO allies in not helping more with the war with Iran from his perspective.
Yeah, there's definitely sort of mood music to that effect. I mean, the president complained about it today again in his meeting with Erdogan, but it wasn't anything you hadn't heard before. His frustration that allies didn't do more to step up for the U.S. The NATO countries, the rest of the European countries, say this is not our job. That NATO is a defensive alliance, and that it's not necessarily our role to step in. And frankly, most of the NATO countries don't have the kind of resources that would have even been particularly useful to the U.S. other than access to air bases in those countries, which for various reasons they didn't provide. So you heard some frustration from the president on that today. Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of the UN, has pushed back on that point, has made the point that several NATO countries did allow the use of their air bases, and notably the Turks have been supportive. But I don't know that this is going to be a lasting issue. I think in part because the president wants to move on from the Iran issue just about as badly as everybody else does at this point.
Let's talk Greenland because it's come up again. It was a huge issue last year, and the president brought it up again today. Here's what he said to reporters.
That should be controlled by the United States, not by Denmark.
Greenland, as we all know, is an autonomous territory of NATO member Denmark. What has been the reaction there today on Greenland, on the president continuing to kind of beat the drum?
Well, the White House telegraphed this, so it was not a surprise. There was a press call the other day. I was on it and actually asked senior administration officials about this. And it is still the administration's position that the best security situation for Greenland long term is not to be part of Denmark, it's to be part of the United States. But also after Davos earlier in the year, when this really kind of wreaked havoc on a big international event, and the president was so embroiled in this controversy, there were some agreements worked out to try to open more U.S. military bases on Greenland, to try to address the security concerns without changing the nature of, you know, the state of Greenland and sort of what flag it flies and what country it's a part of. My sense of this, and it's early, we'll see how much the president talks about this tomorrow, is that most of these NATO leaders are going to largely shrug this off.
Garrett Haake, thank you.
You bet.
So Graham Platner's Senate race in Maine has had a lot of controversies. And the latest may be one he cannot come back from. A former girlfriend, Jenny Rassicott, is alleging that Platner, quote, had sex with her against her will. Here's what she told CNN after describing the incident on Monday.
I don't believe that you can think that that scenario was consensual. You have to understand that that wasn't. When somebody is repeatedly, when somebody in the middle of it says, "Don't touch me," that's obviously not consensual.
So Rassicott was among a group of women who had accused Platner of quote unquote unsettling behavior in a New York Times piece back in June. But this allegation is a new one. In a statement, Platner said, quote, "Any accusation of non-consensual behavior is categorically untrue," unquote, but says he's deciding on whether he's going to stay in the race. So Platner's supporters had stayed with him through a lot of controversies. But are they going to stay with him now? And what could it mean for the Maine Senate race? For this, I want to bring in Ryan Nobles, NBC News chief Capitol Hill correspondent. Hey, Ryan.
Hi, Yas.
So let's talk about Rassicott, because she just came out with this new allegation. And she is saying that she's coming out now because the way in which that New York Times piece was actually received, and that she felt as if people were dismissive of it. They glossed over some of the allegations. and that some maybe thought it was a GOP-led hit piece because one of the women that was profiled in this New York Times piece had worked for some Republican campaigns. What do we know about Rassicot personally, and why else she would be coming out now?
Well, the first thing I think that's important about who she is, in light of how you kind of set the stage for this conversation, is that she's not a Republican operative. In fact, she is a Democrat. And part of what she told Jake Tapper at CNN yesterday was one of the things that she was wrestling with was this idea that she actually wholeheartedly agrees with Graham Platner's politics. She wants to see someone who stands for the things that he stands for get elected to the United States Senate. And she was concerned that if she were too forceful in her allegations, that would derail his campaign. But then she also recognized this idea that someone who treated her in the way she describes that he treated her should also not be a United States senator. And I think what happened yesterday was you saw someone who was brave enough to come forward, put her face on camera. Her face wasn't even obscured, put her name out there. She's now exposed to everyone. And in that environment, she was willing to tell what was a heartbreaking story and directly accuse someone who was running for the United States Senate of raping her. And I think that's the power that's associated with an accusation like that, and the way that someone would be willing to put themselves out there like that, is what has led to this flood of Democrats who were once standing by him through, we should point out, a whole host of other very, very controversial scandals. They stood by him
Warren
through that.
Being one of them.
Yes, Elizabeth Warren. Bernie Sanders actually just came out and said that he spoke with him and has asked him to step aside. So this was just a bridge too far.
So I mentioned Platner's denials so far. He actually released a video on X further denying these allegations.
So, regardless of the inaccuracy of the reporting, but mindful of the political reality it will inflict, we are taking the time to reflect on the best path forward.
What is the likelihood, the possibility, what is being considered as to whether or not he's going to drop out?
So everything that I've heard is that he's seriously considering dropping out. The calculation for him is that he still believes that he has a degree of leverage here because he's the only one that can remove him from the race. It's not as though the state party could come in and say, well, we voted and decided to kick you out. He won the primary fair and square. So he has the agency here to decide whether or not he goes forward. What he would like to see happen is that the process to replace him would lead to someone of his political bent being his replacement. And so there are candidates who are definitely more progressive who have been mentioned as possibilities. Troy Jackson is one of them. He and Platner were one time close. He was considered to be the potential progressive nominee in the primary for governor, which was happening at the same time. He fell short of that. So there are a lot of progressives that are pointing toward him. Now, there's a lot of people.
You want someone with a similar platform.
Yeah, right.
Similar messaging.
And that's what Bernie Sanders said in his statement, is that he also wants to see someone of Platner's persuasion. But I also think there's a lot of people rolling their eyes at the idea of a guy who's been accused of rape would have
Why
any
do you get to
leverage
choose
in this situation. Just go away.
So if we're looking ahead to July 13th, right? If Platner stays in the race, he takes it all the way to November. And you and I have talked about this repeatedly, but Maine is integral to the Democrats winning control of the Senate come November. But if he drops out before this Monday, July 13th deadline, what happens then?
It's not really clear. The only thing we know for sure is that the power rests with the Democratic Party of Maine and their executive committee. So they could theoretically just go into a back room somewhere and come out and say, we've decided that this candidate is going to be our candidate. My guess is they want to avoid at least the appearance of that. So some of the candidates that could potentially emerge are suggesting that there be a series of town halls with interested candidates, that they do some sort of a convention where Maine Democrats can actually come in and have their voice be heard, maybe even cast a ballot that would be part of that process. They would have roughly, depending on when Platner decided to drop out, if he waits until the deadline of the 13th, they'd basically have 2 weeks to do this process. So it would not be, it'd have to be done in a very, very short amount of time. But my guess is that what the party leaders don't want is the appearance that they handpick someone that is connected to the establishment and is not part of of an operation that's going to come and kind of shake things up in Washington, especially because what Platner had really tapped into was this angst around party politics. So, I could see it going either way for Democrats. There could be a lot of excitement around it, and they rally behind a candidate. But I wonder if in the back of their minds they're thinking back to what happened with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, where there wasn't that process.
You think?
Yeah, where they didn't give another group of Democrats an opportunity to be a part of that nomination process, and they would like to avoid that. So they've got a lot of decisions to make. And I will tell you this, yes, just before we go, I think that there's probably the conventional wisdom is like, well, boy, the person that's really benefiting from this is Susan Collins, right? Because she's obviously established there. She's done well. But man, the polling was not great for Graham Platner. He was running even with her or even slightly behind. And if you talk to Maine political operatives, they feel like you've got to be in the public polling at least 3 or 4 points ahead of Susan Collins to beat her because she knows that state so well. The Republican operatives I talked to yesterday were like, this is the best case scenario for Democrats because generic Democrat beat Susan Collins every time. Graham Platner was not beating Susan Collins every time. So they've got a shot here, if they do it the right way, to pick a candidate that has a legitimate chance of putting this state back in play.
Ryan Nobles, as always, thank you.
Thank you.
So Prince Harry has been on a long campaign against British tabloids, saying they violated his privacy again and again. And now it looks like that showdown is coming to an end. So a judge in London's High Court has rejected a privacy lawsuit that Harry and other British celebrities brought against the publisher of the Daily Mail. The legal loss comes amid an awkward visit back home for Prince Harry, who's had a frosty relationship with his family for years now. So I want to bring in Daniele Hamamdjian, our international correspondent and our now royal expert in London. Hi, Danielle.
Hi.
Let's talk about the judgment first, because I think folks need a little bit of a refresher as to what Prince Harry alleged that Associated Newspapers Limited was actually doing.
Yeah, so Prince Harry has had this long-running feud with the British tabloids. He's made it his life's mission to go after them. And there have been lawsuits in the past, but this was, his last case in a string of lawsuits against British media organizations. And he wasn't going about it alone. There are other claimants, high-profile individuals in this case, Elton John and his husband, Elizabeth Hurley, the actress. And they were claiming that there was unlawful behavior by the Daily Mail, and so they were suing the publisher of the Daily Mail. Now, among the things that they were accusing the publisher of, that they had tapped and hacked phones, hired private investigators to secretly place listening devices inside people's cars and homes, and impersonated individuals to obtain medical information and financial records. Where Harry's concerned, we're talking about 14 specific articles written between 2001 and 2013. So by the end of his teens, most of his 20s. And he gave evidence in the beginning of this trial, which was earlier this year. And it was quite emotional. And he told the court how his life had been commercialized since he was a teenager. He said that those articles detailed, for one, like his appointment as godfather to his former nanny's child, intimate details about his relationship with his former girlfriend, Chelsea Davy, including their travel arrangements, their sleeping arrangements. And it sort of amplified his feelings of paranoia. And this was information that Harry said no one else could know. Well, today, in a 400-page judgment, the judge said that they failed to prove that the information laid out in these salacious articles were obtained unlawfully.
The editor-in-chief of A&L framed the verdict as a win for press freedom in the UK. Prince Harry says it's about privacy. Does this ruling, Danielle, set a new precedent?
I think what it does is that it puts an end to the phone hacking saga, which, as you know, has lasted many, many years. We have now a statement from Prince Harry where he says It is a complete and obvious whitewash, but sadly, not altogether unexpected. However, the lengths to which the court has gone to exonerate the Mail is as shocking as it is totally unwarranted. And you're right, Yasmin, the publisher, first of all, always denied the accusations, said it was a magnificent vindication for the Daily Mail's journalism. Also worth pointing out that a former editor who was for a long time at the Daily Mail also put out a statement accusing Harry of hypocrisy for alleging that his privacy had been invaded when he himself has also been very vocal and public about very personal information in regards to the royal family.
So let's talk about the royal family a little bit, because you are our resident royal expert. And this decision is coming amidst quite an awkward time for them, and specifically Prince Harry, because he went there and he's supposed to stay at Buckingham Palace. Then it got walked back. He had planned to travel there with his wife, Meghan Markle, along with their 2 children. Now that's not happening. So what's going on here?
Well, first of all, we don't know for a fact or that Meghan and the children are not joining him for the rest of the trip outside London. So we are still waiting for confirmation there. In regards to Buckingham Palace, it's not straightforward, and there was quite a bit of drama even before he landed in the UK yesterday. Over the weekend, the spokesperson for Prince Harry came out and saying he's accepted an invitation to stay at the palace. Within minutes, various media outlets were quoting the palace as saying, hang on, he RSVP'd too late, effectively. And Buckingham Palace is cited as saying that the appropriate hospitality and staffing provision was no longer available. Now, my first reaction was like, hang on a second. How many bedrooms are there at Buckingham Palace? Is it really that difficult to arrange one room for a member of the family for a couple of nights? What's going on here? Now, just some context. There are large parts of the palace that are under construction. Number 2, there are no VIPs actually staying there right now. Even the king stays down the street. Our understanding is that it's actually getting the right staffing and security in place is probably not the quick fix that we think it is. That may have been the issue here.
It just feels as if he just tried to go home and they told him, sorry, we turned your bedroom into a gym.
I will say this, though, that there are royal insiders who do believe that this now clears the way and paves the way for reconciliation, because it is possible that for the king, though he is Prince Harry's father, he does have a constitutional position and that he cannot compromise. So to have Harry there while a verdict comes out, it just, for optics, does not look very good. But now that this is out, perhaps, just perhaps, they can turn the page and move on.
Daniele Hamamdjian, thank you.
Thanks, Yasmin.
That is going to do it for us at Here's the Scoop from NBC News. I'm Yasmin Vasugan. We'll be back tomorrow with whatever the day may bring. And if you like what you heard and you saw, press the subscribe button. We'll see you tomorrow.
We thank you for watching. And remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.